I want to talk about India's role in the world today as it pertains to relations with the West. I think that this is a very significant thing because when we see the gathering of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Beijing, you expect dictatorships like Russia, China, North Korea, Belarus, the Central Asian republics to work together. You expect them to find common ground. In 2017, India and Pakistan were among those countries that joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. In the case of India, um, what we often hear is India is the world's biggest democracy, exemplified by the fact that it's now the world's most populated country, surpassed China last year, and Indian elections are the biggest elections possible. To put that in context, the electorate of India is roughly three times the entire population of the United States. Not just three times the American electorate, three times the population of the United States. So they're massive events, take place over several months. Um, Modi recently won a third term in last year's general election, albeit with diminished support from previous occasions. Um, Modi has lost some of his support from the 2019 general election. Nevertheless, he's won a historic third term. Now, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about does come down to Modi's leadership, Modi as a leader, because he is a controversial figure. Uh, the question I'm raising with this one is, India calls itself the world's biggest democracy, so how should the world's biggest democracy act in current affairs? Of course, every country in the world acts with a degree of self interest, and that's understandable. India, like every other country, is going to look at what self interests are, understandable. But I will say that I do have serious unease about India's attitude to the war in Ukraine and India pretending to be neutral when it is so clearly pro Putin. Now, before I continue this, I should say, I guess, a disclaimer because I know there'll be some Indian nationals who look at this and think I'm anti India. Well, am I anti India? I have a lot of respect for Indian culture in the sense that I recognise it as one of the world's great civilizations. It goes back to the Indus Valley civilization over three millennia ago. It is one of the world's great civilizations. It's a country rich in culture. There was a comedy recently, romantic comedy talk that was exploring the relationship between a man from the north and a woman from the south. I wanted to go and see it actually. I didn't get my chance, but that's just an example of the diversity within India itself. It's a land that's really rich in culture, and I really hope one day we'll get an opportunity to visit India. As a child, it was, along with China, a country I really wanted to see. Um, as a British national, it would be remiss of me to totally gloss over the history there. And let's be honest, there is the burden of history. Britain was a colonial power in India. It was seen as a jewel of our empire, but there was a lot of resentment, and there is historic resentment there. Nevertheless, I think young Indians today are more concerned about issues around India's economic growth, space program, numerous other issues. I don't think the average Indian spends a huge amount of time thinking about the wrongs of the Raj, except when it pertains to perhaps, looking if you look at a clip of Gandhi online, or perhaps if you have a British Prime Minister visiting India, that then sometimes it crops up. But I don't think it's necessarily in everyday thinking. Um, but I do not agree that former colonial powers should be constantly shackled by guilt. I think there should be an acknowledgement of imperial wrongs for sure. I mean, some of the things we've done in India were appalling, but it is also true that under the Raj, railways were built, hospitals and universities were established. That's just a fact. It's it's a reality. It can't be denied. Um, but there was exploitation. It was based on British interests. There's all of that. But this video is not about the Raj. I just mention it because when we talk about Indo-British relations, it just can't be ignored as a factor, just like if we were talking about French-Algerian relations or Dutch-Indonesian relations, um, or Spanish-Filipino relations, and the list goes on. India has become a confident and fairly powerful country. Last year it surpassed the UK to be the world's fifth biggest GDP. The UK is now sixth. And there were Indian nationalists who were being quite smug about that because we were the old colonial power. However, GDP size is not everything. It's not the same as GDP per capita. And in many ways, millions of Indians still struggle with serious poverty. So GDP size is not everything. There's also a big barometer, a big measuring aspect really should be quality of life. I think that should be a measuring aspect in every country. For instance, access to healthcare, and also treatment of the most vulnerable. Now, India's record on that is nothing to shout about. When you look at caste discrimination, when you look at some of the things that go on with that, and again, this is the sort of thing that Bollywood will often ignore. Bollywood likes to have glitz. It likes to talk about wealth. I see some of the similarities with China. There's understandably people want better quality of life. They look at materialistic things, but the problem there is it does present a false image. So one of the criticisms of Bollywood is far too often it's a sanitized version of India. It doesn't really show the real India in that sense. But people want escapism, and that's what the movies are for, right? It's the same with Hollywood in many ways. But can the West trust India? Well, one thing that I think about with this is Modi's mixed messaging. I mean, earlier this year, he visited the UK and he signed a big trade agreement with Starmer. And on the surface, I welcome that because India is a major economy. It's a major Asian power. It's a country that we can't ignore. And it is a country that will forever have links to this country because of the Indian diaspora and the sheer fact that we have millions of citizens, British citizens, who are of Indian descent. So that link, no matter what disputes we have, will always be there. So, for example, there's a far bigger Indian presence in the UK in that sense than Russian or Chinese. So it can never be ignored. Rishi Sunak was the first British Prime Minister, British Indian Prime Minister. Although he had a short premiership, he fostered quite good relations with Modi. Starmer so far has seemed to have quite good relations with Modi. I don't trust Modi, but I will say this: I think he's a capable statesman. I think he's a populist. He is at times been a demagogue, and I think all the controversy that it attracts is well warranted. But I don't think he's stupid. I think he's capable enough to pander to Russia on one hand whilst reassuring the West on the other. And yet that reassuring, I'm not sure if it is entirely convincing. This is the big issue I've got with Modi's approach regarding Russia. The trade between India and Russia goes way back, so it's not surprising. And in the Cold War, Indira Gandhi, the last Cold War, Indira Gandhi had very close ties to Moscow whilst Pakistan was pro-West. So there is that history. And that needs to be understood when we look at Indian continued trade with Russia. Okay, so that's why India is reluctant, obviously, to sever any trade. That would be a very foolish move from an economic perspective. But for me, there is this issue of what should the world's biggest democracy portray? Should the world's biggest democracy be cozying up to a brutal dictatorship that kidnaps millions of children from Ukraine? India says it respects the sovereignty of other countries. So does it respect the sovereignty of Ukraine? Does it acknowledge that the Putin regime doesn't even acknowledge Ukraine as a sovereign state? When we've looked at India's record on this, what we've seen is a reluctance to condemn Russia. When there's been major UN votes on Russia's aggression in Ukraine, India has abstained. It hasn't sided with Russia, but it's abstained. Now, an abstention in this situation represents an overt cautiousness that, to me, is not leadership. It's definitely not leadership. I would say that Modi and New Delhi have failed to show leadership when it comes to Ukraine. In fact, they've utterly failed. And look at the body language. When Modi meets Putin, he greets him like an old friend. It's hugs, it's warm, it's very pally. When he met Zelensky, it was a handshake. It was businesslike. It wasn't rude, but it was formal. So that's significant. I remember early in the invasion, there were Indian students trapped in, I think it was Kherson or one of the other cities. So they would have directly experienced Russian aggression. And these are questions as to why India can honestly, with a straight face, claim to be neutral. I would say that neutrality is very questionable. I mean, I think there is something in the old adage that if you fail to condemn oppression, you're taking the side of the oppressor. Ironically, I think it was Gandhi that quoted that, but I'm not 100% sure. I think it may have been Gandhi, or it was one of the 20th century's anti-colonialist figures. I'm not 100% sure if that was Gandhi or not. Nevertheless, side with the neutrality when you side with the oppressor is not neutrality, and I think that's true of India and Ukraine. What I want to say to Indian nationalists who get defensive about this is, why can't India bring itself to condemn atrocities in Ukraine? Bucha, Mariupol, Kramatorsk. Now, recently, Trump has threatened to tariff India or increase tariffs because of India's trade deals with Russia. On one hand, I would be tempted to welcome that because I do think New Delhi should face pressure over its support for the Russian war machine. On the other hand, it's coming from Donald Trump, who only this last month has welcomed Putin to Anchorage. So in some ways, when it comes to standing up to Russia, I hate to say it, but European countries are looking quite lonely. We have Japan, South Korea, Canada, Australia, but unfortunately a large part of the world has either stuck by Russia due to trade, has been ostensibly neutral on the issue, or seen it as just two neighbours squabbling without recognising what it is, a powerful country subjugating a smaller neighbour. So it's one of the saddest things of our time, a little bit like when Assad was butchering people in Syria. A large part of the world seemed to have no problem defending Bashar Assad, and it needs to be asked, where is the moral judgment there? Is it just a question of being anti-West, or is it genuine ignorance about what is actually happening in Ukraine? Now, more specifically on the issues between Ukraine and the UK, between India and the UK, is India anti-UK? It's hard to tell, not necessarily. I think most British tourists who go to India have a good time, and generally they say Indian people are welcoming. I personally, like I said at the start of the video, I hope one day to visit India. But do I trust India? Honestly, in terms of the government direction, no, not entirely. I mean, if you look at Indian media outlets, if you look at, for example, WAYON or Gravitas, and I would single out Palki Sharma. She's a prominent presenter on WAYON News. She is vociferously anti-West to the point of an obsession. She's constantly railing against the UK and the US and other Western countries, particularly the UK. And so there's this contradiction. On one hand, India is very confident. On the other hand, there still seems to be this deep insecurity about respect. Well, you can't demand respect and not show any in return. It doesn't work that way. I remember when India had its successful lunar program in 2023, I believe it was. And understandably, there was a lot of celebrations over that. India was the first country, I believe, to get a lunar module in the south pole of the moon, which is technically a very difficult thing to do. It wasn't 100% a domestic program. There was actually some satellite support from the UK and elsewhere. But nevertheless, it was an Indian-led mission and it was a success. It was a major achievement. But I remember Indian nationalists were sort of demanding respect from the West while simultaneously insulting the West. How does that work? You can't demand respect from someone that you're simultaneously showing hostility to. And that's kind of the paradox with Indian nationalists. So what I would say is, if India is truly as confident as you claim it is, why the hostility to the West? Why this demand for respect? Um, Modi, when he visited the UK, was respectful, polite, diplomatic, and there was some compromise reached on the trade agreements there. But I think if we look at the direction of Indian state media or those media outlets, I mean, if I were Keir Starmer, I would say to Modi, look, I appreciate you can't control this, but what are your thoughts on it? You know, what is the direction of the India that you're governing? Um, is it pro or anti-West? Do you want to work with us or not? Because so often I see this attitude of, can India trust the West? Well, I say, why not reverse the question? Can the West trust India? Why should it always be pandering to what the other side wants? I frankly think that this country, particularly, and especially under Keir Starmer, is far, far too hesitant to be more outspoken about our national interests. Um, and what I mean by that is there is an overt desire to please others rather than do what is best for this country. Um, Now, I think trade agreement with India is important, but I do think if I were Starmer, I would have raised that issue. There's also some ongoing legal issues with British nationals in India. There was a case of a man who is in an Indian prison, and there's serious questions on his guilt. He's British Indian, but there's serious questions on that situation. There's all sorts of things going on that behind the scenes, you know, that prime minister to prime minister may not discuss, but maybe they should be discussed at other levels in a more prominent way. So, in conclusion, I think that India should be taken seriously. It's a powerful country. It's a nuclear power. It's a massive military. Um, huge GDP. Nevertheless, not huge per capita GDP. It's still got significant poverty. There's still significant sectarian tensions, and India does have serious human rights abuses, particularly around caste discrimination. I remember I was at an international youth group, and the two Indian girls, when they came to this presentation, one of the Dutch, it was in the Netherlands, one of the Dutch people in the audience asked about that, and they just outright denied it. It doesn't exist. It's a Western invention. Well, that's simply not true. It isn't a Western invention. It absolutely does exist, despite legislation passed, despite drives to prevent that from happening. It does still exist. India is still a pretty chaotic country. You see situations of mob violence that just erupt over sometimes not trivial things, but things that, you know, really shouldn't result in that. There is definitely that element there. So when Indian nationalists boast about the world's biggest democracy, those are not things to boast about. I think a truly confident country doesn't need to always be lashing out the way that we see from Indian media outlets. Now, the fact that India is a multi-party democracy and the fact that Modi cannot have a control on media outlets it's a good thing, and it does set India apart from China. Nevertheless, I think it would be valid to say, what's your thoughts on this? Do you agree with the anti-West rhetoric coming from We All News, from Gravitas? Let's not forget Narendra Modi, as Chief Minister of Gujarat, was accused of inciting severe violence in the riots in the early 2000s. I believe it was 2001 or 2002. Up to 2,000 people killed, many of them Muslims, but also Hindus. Modi has long been seen as a far-right Hindu nationalist. On his watch, there has been an increase in tolerance of Indian Christians, Sikhs and Muslims. That's a reality. Only a few years ago, 2020, there was a violent anti-Muslim pogrom in Delhi, up to 60 people killed. So when this sort of thing happens, is that really a sign of progress? You know, you could put lunar module on the moon, but when you're burning people alive in the street, it's not exactly something to shout about. You know, that contradiction. I'm going to wrap this up, but I think that we shouldn't treat India the same as Russia and China. I think we should still treat India as a partner, especially with the UK. There is a unique relationship there. But India is a confident country, it is a powerful country. It's a country that can't be ignored. But I would say that Indian claims of neutrality when it comes to Ukraine need to be questioned. Modi needs to explain why he hasn't condemned Russian aggression. And yes, there is deep trade ties, but I would argue that it's a failure of leadership by India not to condemn the atrocities in Ukraine. And my question for any Indian nationals who are supporting Modi's stance is is that is that a worthy position for the world's biggest democracy to take, to show silence, to show abstentions when children are being kidnapped, when people are being butchered? Shouldn't the world's biggest democracy use its power to speak out a bit more? I mean, I actually think if New Delhi was more outspoken in those sort of things, I would say, yeah, I would give Modi a lot of credit. Um, but Modi needs to decide, if India is the world's biggest democracy, is it going to pal up with dictatorships, or is it going to be friendly with other democracies? I think India needs to make a decision. These claims of neutrality are questionable.